And we are live. Hello, everyone. This is My Two Cents. Tonight, I am joined by Hoploo. Some of you may remember about a month ago, I had Esoteric the Free on my channel. We did a live stream on the topic of left market anarchism and Eso's views on what the most appropriate way libertarians should spread the message of liberty is, or how should libertarians go about attempting to create a free society. And Eso shared his views on that. However, shortly thereafter, I was given an opportunity to moderate a debate between Eso and Filthy Heretic and Hoploo and Atomic ANCAP on the subject of Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hoploo takes Hans Hermann Hoppe's view on, and well, actually, let me introduce that. Perhaps a more notable view in contrast to, say, Eso's view on libertarianism is that of Hans Hermann Hoppe. He's the author of a book called Democracy, the God That Failed. The main point of that, it's a collection of essays, and Hoppe, coming from a libertarian standpoint, makes the argument that many people would say that even if the state itself is inherently unjust, at least democracies are preferable to monarchies. Hoppe says that's actually not true. He takes the view that monarchies are, in fact, preferable to democracy, and that democracy, as we know it today, is, in fact, what is responsible for many of the problems society is currently experiencing, such as unemployment rates, public debt, social security systems, and from that baseline, Hoppe goes on to explain what he thinks the best way to achieve a libertarian society is. Now, the criticism that is often brought against him by people like Eso and others is that Hoppe's views are not in fact libertarian, but are rather a gateway into fascism and the alt-right. So that is a lot. That's a quick intro to what this debate is about. But Hoppe takes a view. Hoploo takes the view opposite Eso of Hoppe. So I'm going to quick let Hoploo introduce himself, and then we're going to get into that discussion. So Hoploo, go ahead.
Hello, I'm the ANCAP animator who's always on hiatus. Yeah, I've been making a bunch of craziness in the circles of anarcho-capitalism that we're all in about Hans Hermann Hoppe, how I believe that the people who I refer to as Team Gray, or the Konkanites, misinterpret not only Hoppe but Hoppeans, their viewpoints. They believe that Hoppeans are some super different ethical structure of anarchy, rather than really just being anarcho-capitalism, but with a different methodology. And of course, as My Two Cents said, that Hoppe and his work is in fact a gateway drug to fascism with his rhetoric and with his ideas and the like. So that means clearly you shouldn't read Hoppe, or you shouldn't listen to Hoppe, or you might risk becoming a fascist somehow.
Okay. Well, for starters then, since it would be your contention that many libertarians misunderstand what Hoppe's actual argument is, could you summarize as best you can what you believe Hoppe's thesis in Democracy, the God That Failed is?
Well, I think that most people don't necessarily have that big of a problem, like anarchists especially, with Hoppe pointing out that monarchy is less destructive to society than democracy, unless it's sort of a oh, well, if you say any state is better than another, then you're clearly a statist, unless it's those types, which of course I do not have many kind words for. But I'd say that most contention comes from, of course, the infamous quote about physical removal. Now, most people believe that physical removal is synonymous with free helicopter rides, which is, of course, a reference to the method of execution that the 1973 Chilean coup used against the Communist Party, where they where Pinochet loaded the commies into helicopters and threw them into the Atlantic Ocean at terminal velocity. Many people think that's what physical removal is, but that is not true. Not only, like, just to give you a start, the English conception, especially with the free helicopter rides memes, makes you think that physical removal means something a lot more violent than it actually is. Like, for example, you're gonna be removed. We're gonna remove you. Whereas, if you actually look at what "quote unquote" removed means in German, it actually just translates to separation, which of course gives you an idea of what the phrase physical removal, as Hoppe uses it, actually means. What it means is, of course, physical separation. How do you physically separate someone from society? You know, physically remove people from society, physically separate people from society. How do you do that? Well, with property rights. If you don't like someone being on your property, you have the right to tell them, get off my property. And of course, if enough people do this to say someone who's a bad neighbor, let's say he litters all over his yard, he plays loud music at 11, he's a slob, he screams at his wife every morning for hours on end, he's an overall unpleasant member of the community. How do you get rid of him? By first by physical removal. And how do you physically remove him? You ostracize him. You deny him access to your roads, to your shops, to your utilities until he's incentivized to sell his property and move away to somewhere that would probably be more accepting of his lifestyle. So that's what physical removal means. It is just disassociation and sort of disassociation to organized society. That's what it means. And I'll get into what covenant communities mean, which is another point of contention. But I think you got a $30 donation.
Okay, yes, I did see that. Jinyu, thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, so next I'd like to circle back for a minute to the first point that has made Hoppe famous about how he says that monarchies are in fact preferable to democracies. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the main points there is that he would say in a democracy or a republic or any kind of representative government like that, where politicians are elected for 8 years in office, they have an incentive. They have a direct incentive to milk the system as hard as they can for the time they are in office. Whereas a monarch who is in his position for life would have more of an incentive to ensure long-term prosperity. Would you say that's an accurate representation of his view, or is there more to it?
Well, kinda. He defines democracy as a publicly owned government. So really, the rate of elections, if there are any, are irrelevant. So, for example, you wouldn't really define a communist dictatorship, Soviet dictatorship, as a monarchy, but really just a democracy where people don't get to vote. And he points out the fact that dictatorships, be it communist or fascist, are essentially the outcome or a logical end of democracy, as quite literally translating to people power, you know? So, in essence, mob rule. Basically, while a monarch is quite simply, be it in the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, early or Enlightenment era, maybe the prehistoric Bronze Iron Age, all of those monarchs essentially held their territories as their property, you know, like sort of the mafia, as opposed to a heavily bureaucratic or state that is supposed to be representative or representing the people. Their territories are quite basically their property, and you can especially see this in in the Middle Ages, where almost every aspect of their holdings were property, whereas in say the fascist or communist dictatorships and even the Roman Empire, the idea of the state, even though there weren't any elections, was that the state is the voice of the people, or it is the state of the people. the proletariat dictatorship and whatnot. So what this leads to, even if the person cannot be voted out of power, is of course a looting of the territories it holds, and the passing of short-term policies for the sake of either the electoral base or the party, be it communist or fascist or whatnot, so as to basically just loot the country for his interests, and of course bribe the people into submission. You know.
Okay.
Whereas, of course, if a monarch were to loot his country, that would be on his heir, and of course if he does not care about his heir, of course, let's say he's only living for himself, his heir can go fuck himself, then the people who have claims or interest in the throne will quite obviously send someone to remove the king's body from his head.
Okay. Now, on that note, I know when I think of monarchies, the key detail that seems to come to mind is the hereditary passing down. There are those who would say a king is no different from a dictator, but at least in my mind, the first thing that comes to mind that would make a monarchy different from a dictatorship is the definitive hereditary passing down of rule. Would you say, in Hoppe's view, that's necessarily part of a monarchy? Or
definitely, but another thing that should be noted about dictatorships is that if Stalin wasn't appeasing the Communist Party or wasn't taking control of the Communist Party, they would have very easily thrown him out, you know? Will go to his heir. So, yeah.
Okay.
Pretty much what you're saying.
All right. So moving on then, I know Hoppe's next contention would be that democracy brings specifically many of the problems that we see in our society today, the few that are listed in the summary of his book: unemployment rates, expanding public debt, and social security systems. These are inherent failures of democracy, but
Absolutely.
they would not be inherent failures of a monarchy. Can you explain that a little further?
I don't know if he said inherent or not, but I do know for a fact that those problems are a lot more likely to occur in a democracy rather than a monarchy. Like, for example, if you look at sort of the various programs or that say a democracy almost instantaneously institutes, even in Athens or the Roman Republic, just almost instantaneously instituted how much bureaucracy they created, as opposed to, say, a monarchy, which is an almost bare bones government. You know, just, hey, this guy's going to be collecting taxes, and yeah, he's going to be doing that and whatnot. Whereas in a democracy, there are a whole bunch of bureaus being created, and it's a lot harder to liquidate or to abolish these bureaus under a democracy, as there's a lot more politicization, whereas a king can just say, hey, it's my money, get out. But even then, if you look at, say, the difference in, say, imperialism during the Middle Ages, where it was mostly dominated by feudal monarchs, even the most statist and centralized monarchs, the wars would basically just be a lord rallying a few thousand guys, armed guys, to go over to another, either a little fort or a little patch of land owned by a rival lord, who has his own armed thugs. They would duke it out for a bit, and one side would run away, and there would be like maybe a few casualties, maybe a few hundred at the most. Whereas when Europe was dominated by republics and democracies, you get World War I. And I forget how many million people were killed by that. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, at this point, let's talk about what's likely to be one of the first objections from those who would say that democracy is preferable to monarchy. And that is that at least in a democracy or a republic or some form of representative government, you have checks and balances that exist to limit the power of individuals in a government, whereas a monarch having absolute rule, what stops him from, or let's take a classic Bible story. King David sees another man's wife, says, she's hot, I want her, I'm the king, I can have whatever I want. The defender of democracy would say, well, at least in a representative government, you have checks against something like that. In a monarchy, you wouldn't. What would you say would Hoppe's response be?
Well, I'm not the expert on this point as many as he is. I do actually have a little bit of a response to that, and that is basically that monarchs do in fact have a sort of incentive to be more reserved with what they do. I know for a fact that King David ran into a plethora of problems after raping the woman whose name I can't remember. For example, if, say, the country goes to shit under a monarch, well, guess who's going to be paying for that? It's going to be the monarch. Whereas if, say, either a party dictator or an elected official turns his country to shit, it's I don't care. But even then, let's say you have the Constitution and the state. I actually do think that the American system was a very, very fine, sort of the early American system, even when the Federalists instituted their coup. It was a very fine system on paper, There weren't many ways it could go wrong, but when you really think about it, the only way to have any sort of checks and balances whatsoever is to not have a monopoly on violence. That was the original idea of, say, the American Republic. If the federal government goes to hell, then at the very least you have the state governments who will nullify or secede to counter them. But as you know, the federal government obtained vast amounts of wealth to trump any power the states might have to nullify or to resist the federal government.
Yes, and I would say that was why Jefferson opposed the idea of having a standing army at all.
Oh, of course. But the American government did it anyways. And I think another thing to point out is that republics and democracies will of course do a lot more looting from their population, because the bureaucracies they will create, and as such they will spend it a lot more, because especially considering their decreased lack of economic sense that a monarch would have. So basically what I'll say is that on paper a republic or a democracy does in fact have checks and balances, but in reality, what happens is that the democratic state will erode these checks and balances and will ultimately make them might as well have never existed in the first place, which of course has happened in every democracy that has existed, including and especially the ones that have degenerated into dictatorships. Be it Rome or whatnot. But a monarch, well, he doesn't necessarily have checks and balances on paper, but even though historically the feudal kings were very limited in their capabilities, even be it in England, France, or Germany. But even if the king could do whatever he wanted, he would have an economic sense to be a lot more reserved than the democratically elected official or the dictator.
Okay. All right. Next, let's move on. I know you already mentioned it once, but the topic of covenant communities then also comes up very heavily in Hoppe's work. Can you explain what he means by that and how he thinks it's an instrument to a libertarian society?
Basically, so I mentioned what physical removal is and how it works earlier on, and basically, It's people disassociating with people disassociating with people who are being bad neighbors. You know, Hoppe points out the bad neighbor problem of someone who is trashing their yard and making their house into a brothel aren't violating the non-aggression principle, but it's still not a good thing to have in society. So the way you could get rid of that in a libertarian order is, of course, by ostracizing him. A covenant community is quite simply the voluntary contractual organization of that, as well as a few other services. So, for example, let's say that you have a neighborhood of property owners, and in them is this guy named Bob. Bob is a bastard. He plays loud music at night. He has a dirty yard. He's an overall, he's a bastard, you know. So how does the in order for the rest of the neighborhood to preserve their sanity, they create a contract that they will voluntarily sign, and on that contract it has rules where if you sign this contract, you cannot play loud music past 10. You have to keep your yard clean, etc., etc. But if you do sign this contract and abide by the rules, maybe pay a few dues too, then you'll have access to the public utilities that the covenant organizers own. Like, for example, let's say that the covenant organizers, which of course can be in any shape it wants, depending on the neighborhood. So, for example, if a neighborhood wants to own the covenant and its properties jointly, or if there's, say, a single property owner or landlord, or if whatever, you know. So the organizers will either build or buy, say, the road, the public utilities, maybe a pool or so. And of course, if you are not part of the covenant or a contract, or you haven't signed on the contract or are breaking the rules of the contract, you will be denied access to these properties. So, for example, Bob the Bastard, he's not part of the covenant, so he's going to be denied access to the road, to the public utilities, to the pool, etc., etc. So he'll have some costs imposed on him, and if he does not want to put up with the costs, what he'll do is he'll, of course, sell his house and move somewhere more accepting of his lifestyle, and be replaced by someone who would fit more in the covenant community.
Okay,
and,
so
yeah, go ahead.
Would you say this is a fair summary? Libertarians, including myself, obviously often point to the illegitimacy of the social contract. There is no social contract. No one ever signed it. But a covenant community would be, rather than a social contract, an explicit contract.
Absolutely.
It would be at least at face value, it would look very much like the societies we have today, but rather than the state's authority being derived from this non-existent social contract, the authority would be derived from an explicit contract that all members of the community have signed.
Yes, and there are a few other details, like, for example, many people very mistakenly and very stupidly like to say that covenant communities are a monopoly on arbitration. They are not. If a covenant community does not hold up its end of the bargain of the contract, or gets into a dispute with someone else, it is not the covenant community that will be doing the judging. It will be a third party. Whereas if it were that is the opposite of a monopoly on violence. Whereas in an actual monopoly on violence, for example, the state, if a state does not hold up its end of the contract, let's say it violates its constitution and whatnot, or if it gets into a dispute with one of its citizens, it will not be a third party that judges the state and the citizen it infringed upon, but it will in fact be the state that will judge itself, you know?
Yeah, and it's of course the analogy is it's like the referee playing in the game.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing, of course, is the fact that a covenant community must be voluntary. So if say a covenant if the form of the covenant community is inappropriate for an area, let's say you have a Catholic covenant community with Catholic rules in a Jewish community, um, the the covenant community will not get any signers, will probably go bankrupt, and its assets will, of course, be liquidated to a more appropriate holder or a more appropriate covenant community. So the Catholic covenant goes bankrupt and gets replaced with a Jewish covenant, which is more, which is what the neighborhood would demand. You know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see the argument you're making there.
Yeah.
All right.
And oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, finish your thought. I was going to go on to the next question, but finish your thought.
Oh, okay. And a lot of people like to say that this is no different from a state, but that is the opposite of the case. A state is not a group. You know, a state is a monopoly on arbitration or ultimate decision making. Whereas if people organize themselves into these little covenants or these little groups, that it's basically no different from, say, a Discord server. The owner or the administrators of a Discord server set the rules. If you want to be in the server, you have to abide by them. If you don't abide by the rules, the admins are going to ban you. You know, that's not a state. That's just a private association. But even then, there are also a lot of there are also like a ton of socioeconomic benefits of covenant communities, which I will briefly go into, and is why I believe that they will in fact be dominant in Ancapistan. The first of which is the fact that the covenant community effectively solves the who will build the roads problem, or what is referred to as the public goods problem. So, for example, states will point out, well, you can't have competing sewers, or you can't have sewer services provided privately because you're going to have a bunch of digging up of roads and whatnot, and that's going to cause a bunch of discoordination. Whereas if you have covenant communities, you'll say, well, the covenant community is going to handle a road or the sewers, and they're going to be deciding if the roads should be torn up for this service or another. It's like, for example, a hotel. You don't pay separately for the elevator and the room, you know? Another benefit is, of course, the fact that societies can more easily coordinate and organize the different cultures. So, for example, if say there's a bigger mass of LGBT peoples or gay peoples and whatnot, they can easily coordinate themselves and build pro-homosexual or pro-LGBT covenant communities where you have to respect trans rights and whatnot, refer to them as their pronouns. You can't be homophobic. You gotta do something like that. Whereas next door, there could in fact be a Christian fundamentalist community who abides 100% by the word of God, and they organize themselves. You have to follow God's word. You have to follow the Ten Commandments and whatnot. And they can, of course, peacefully coexist. But what's more is that you can easily, if, say, someone is not accepted in the Catholic community, and what he can do is, of course, liquidate his property or sell his property and, of course, move on over to the LGBT community. And lastly, because I know I'm taking a bit too much time on this, there's also a economic allocation benefit. So, for example, merchants will, of course, sell things that would be more useful to the LGBT community, or marketing campaigns that are more useful to the, or more appealing to LGBTs, can, of course, market and sell in the LGBT covenant. So, for example, instead of selling diapers and pacifiers and bottles, they will sell things like, say, condoms, lubricant, etc., etc. Whereas in the Catholic community, they'll be selling things more for childbearing. But yeah, I hope I got my point across.
Oh, yep, I understood, and looking at the comments, I think everyone else did too. We've been going for half an hour now, and I want to make sure I'd like to keep this at about an hour, so let's make sure there's enough discussion for this. Well, the big now, of course, let's get to the main objection to Hoppe. There are those libertarians who have announced, well, regardless of what Hoppe's intentions are, it seems there is these large number of people who read Hoppe, and about 6 months later, they're chanting alongside Richard Spencer and the alt-right. Well, clearly, Hoppe is the gateway to fascism, and his endorsement of monarchy as opposed to democracy, it must have something to do with that. What is your response to that?
Well, firstly, there is neither any empirical nor rational evidence to support this. So that's the first thing. Sorry, I'm a bit dry. But secondly, there's if you actually examine like the people that a lot of them mention, like for example, Tanner Croson, True Dill Tom, Stefan Molly Meme, etc., etc. Tanner, you can ask Tanner, and he'll tell you it was not Hoppe who made him alt-right, but Hoppe who kept him from being alt-right for too long. True Dill Tom was, of course, groomed by a bunch of first proprietarians and then absolutists. Sorry. And Stefan Molly Meme, of course, is the literal definition of a sellout. And the more alt-right types have more donations to give him than libertarians. Like, those are the three I can mention off the top of my head. I don't know much about that guy T, Love Life and Anarchy, or Christopher Cantwell, except for the fact that the last one's a fad. But yeah, there is no there's like no real evidence to support this. But all right, I know for a fact that there is in fact some semblance of a libertarian to alt-right pipeline, but I do not believe it is in any way because of Hans Hermann Hoppe, or at the very least, not by reading Hoppe, you know? So the biggest, a thing to note that I keep mentioning but never seems to get to people is that the libertarian to alt-right pipeline is over. It has collapsed, you know? As did the Libertarian alt-right alliance, which of course just so coinkadinkly happened to be around the time that there really was a libertarian alt-right pipeline, which of course was in 2017, early 2018. So why was there in fact a libertarian alt-right pipeline? It's not because of Hoppe. In fact, if you actually use Hoppe's arguments, a lot of the people who have claimed to be Hoppians or are claimed to have been Hoppians and turned to the alt-right because of them, they will falter in the face of Hoppe's own arguments. So it's clearly not the fact that they have read Hoppe that made them alt-right. In fact, let me tell you what it is that makes people alt-right. It's the alt-right, you know? So 2017, 2018, or early 2018, that was sort of like the height of not necessarily the derangement syndrome or the various schemes that Team Blue tried to use to get him out of office, but it was definitely the height of, say, Antifa and whatnot to this day, which of course caused, or at the very least the Antifa scare, which of course caused a lot of paranoia, a lot of shaking of the boots on on both libertarians, conservatives, and of course the alt-right. So what they did, of course, was say, all right, well, we'll set aside our differences so that we can combat this leftist scourge of communists, which, of course, ended very spectacularly. Just to give people history, it did not end well. The people were getting too friendly with each other, and that, of course, exposed and brought out their various differences, which led to a lot of anger, a lot of fighting, a lot of arguments, etc., etc. And it led to the alt-right hating libertarians more than they ever did before in the present day, with well, I probably shouldn't say how I refer to Nick Fuentes on your stream, or Tucker Carlson and the like, who believe that libertarians are like this establishment position. So there is the prospect of a libertarian to alt-right alliance, and as such a pipeline, which I'll explain in a bit, sorry, is of course 100% over, because we've realized that we fucking hate each other.
Well, definitely, that's certainly true.
Yeah.
I will say, just as a personal anecdote, 2016, 2017, when the term alt-right first started becoming big, I'll be honest, I could not make heads or tails out of it. I first heard the term alt-right, and I had no idea what it meant. I looked at several different YouTubers who were being who at least nominally were being associated with the alt-right, whether they themselves called themselves alt-right. People that come to mind at the time: Stefan Molyneux, Lauren Southern, two individuals who I had liked content they had done up to that point, so I wondered what it was about. It wasn't until Richard Spencer went on, ironically enough, Roaming Millennials channel, and she interviewed him, that which he had at that point been identified as the figurehead or nominal leader of the alt-right. And when I listened to him explain his viewpoints, I said, holy crap, this guy's a socialist. Why on earth is the term right even in the name? But
yeah, that's basically what caused the alliance to collapse. It was libertarians realizing, oh god, these guys are filthy fucking commies, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, what really caused the libertarian to alt-right pipeline was the fact that the alt-right has a lot more psychological pressure than libertarians, because it was not only libertarians that were turning over to the alt-right. It was also the skeptoid community, also known as democratic socialists, who, of course, had basically what happened was that you had a lot of these people who did not give a fuck about their reputations or the right opinion, coming out and saying and pointing out things such as the Jewish question or race realism. And because these ideas have been buried for so long by, of course, progressive and even conservative media, there was not as much of an immediate response to them. And it was mostly just a, you shut up, racist! You shut up, anti-Semite! And, of course, that combined with the fact that the alt-right are neats, they like to swarm things, you know, like the bugs they are. This made it seem like there's a lot more of them than, say, the skeptoids. You know, like they're a legitimately rising force, and you know, to some degree they are. But the point I'm trying to make is the fact that libertarians and the skeptoids have lost the rhetorical battle. It was not Hoppe that caused people to become alt-right. It was not Hoppe's pointing out of the fact that democracy is an inferior system to monarchy, which of course is an inferior system to anarchy. It was not that fact that turned people alt-right. It was the fact that the alt-right won the battle. You know? And obviously they aren't as strong or as convincing as they were back in the day of 17 and whatnot. and you can see a lot of people really getting fed up with their bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
But the damage has been done, and there is a lot of people to reallocate yet again. But yeah, to blame this on Hoppe is, I'll explain why it's ridiculous in just a minute, but it is blatantly false, and I'd appreciate it if people would stop doing that. But anyways, another thing is that this is, of course, very fallacious logic. If you say that, like, this is the kind of shit that says that, oh, if you point out the fact that there are problems with immigration, that's gonna make people turn into mass shooters, or PewDiePie has turned people into Nazis and whatnot. Like that, it's the same kind of fallacy, and it just drives me insane that people are employing that with a straight face, and are and some, not all, not specific people. Well, actually, yes, specific people, but some, not all, are getting mad at me for saying no, that's not true. You know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you is I feel like too often in some of these debates we have, the person who's trying to articulate their view barely has said 2 sentences before somebody is screeching, no, that's not right, and like, hold on, I didn't even finish my point. You can't possibly know that I wasn't right. Now, maybe I could be wrong, but if we don't allow the other side to talk, we're not going to actually understand where we're coming from. So
yeah.
All right, so at this point, then, can you summarize what you think it is an accurate summation of what Hoppe's view is as to how we achieve a libertarian free society? What is starting right now where we're at with a large centralized republic / democracy? What does he think the correct path for libertarians is to a free society?
Basically, to tear the state bit by bit, until you can basically just sweep it away into history. And the way you do this, of course, is by the magic of secessionism. Now, many people, of course, are opposed to secessionism, namely the gray types, because of the fact that, oh no, you're not abolishing the state. You're creating a new one. But here's the thing. I mean, yeah, I'm technically creating a new state, but at the same time, I'm leaving yet another state less powerful, less expansive, with less assets and whatnot. So, for example, let's say you have 3 cities: City A, City B, City C, and each of them has a military asset or a financial asset that can be used to, say, quash a revolution in one of the cities. And let's say that they're all under a single state, and that state is, of course, tyrannical. So the people in City C decide to stage a protest or a revolution. And because they're staging a revolution in City C, it's hard for the state to get City C's assets to mobilize and, of course, to quash them. But what they can do is mobilize City A and City B's assets to quash the revolution in City C. So you'd either need the City C revolution to resist the assets that the state would throw at them, or to have all 3 cities rise up at once. This has, of course, happened, but at the same time, it's a lot easier to rise up against a tyrannical government if City A, City B, and City C were all independent states. And even if they were military allies, there would, of course, be a disadvantage, or at the very least, a relative disadvantage to if they were in under a single banner, you know.
I think for the point you're making, as opposed to, say, the United States, where you've got 50 separate state governments, but you have one U.S. Army, it would be 50 states with their own armies wearing their own uniforms, flying under their own banners.
Yeah.
Clearly, there's it's not as it would not, even if all the 50 are allied with one another, the individual militaries view themselves as individual militaries, perhaps militaries that ally for a common purpose sometimes, but whereas the United States, it's one army that operates under a single general that operates, stays in a common interest all the time.
Absolutely. So, yeah, as you say. So it's easier to remove the tyrannical state that's infringing on the cities or the states if they're just the cities or the states. And of course, what you do is you repeat this secession. You split the United States up into the different regions. So you create the CSA, you create New England, you create the Midwest, the California Republic, Free Texas, etc., etc. Then you go and break those countries up into their individual states, and then you break those individual states into their individual counties or cities or municipalities or local governments, and you can vary. Not only, of course, is it the fact that these little local governments or smaller governments are, of course, for various reasons, much less destructive to society than the nation state. But it is also a fact that it is easier to transition from the local government from the, say, like, for example, it's easier to abolish the state of Liechtenstein or Monaco or Singapore than it is to abolish the state of China or Russia or America or Brazil,
Yes, and there are those libertarians who would say, well, look, a state is a state. The initiation of force is inherently unjust. And well, I would agree the initiation of force is inherently unjust. I think you do need to exercise a little more nuance than that, in as much as if you asked any person, would you rather live under the United States government or under the government of Fidel Castro, Joseph Stalin? And assuming those are your only two choices.
Yeah.
If a person says, well, obviously, I would rather live under the United States government, then you have just acknowledged that regardless of whether or not states are themselves just, that doesn't mean you can't distinguish between the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point. A lot of people who I will not name by names like to say, oh, well, I'll just choose neither. Well, you can't choose neither. You can't choose neither just yet, anyways. Because, like, even if you're an agorist, even if you, well, not necessarily an agorist, but a counter-economist specifically, like, you believe that the black market is the way to abolish the state and whatnot, it's easier to practice the black market, and you're going to have a lot less death and destruction if you practice agorism in Singapore than if you are in India or China or whatnot, these massive territories,
Okay. Now, here's a question. Do you think agorism would necessarily be mutually exclusive from, say, Hoppe's strategy? No. Okay.
Like, I believe that, like, I have my own doubts on the counter-economist strategy, but I do believe that, like, there are, of course, many inherent advantages to, say, the black market, like, for example, gun running, or providing, or imports, providing starving people with food and whatnot. Like, that's obviously indisputably a good thing. But I don't believe that, of course, that buying Bitcoin or trading exclusively in the black market, which, of course, is impossible, I don't believe that you're going to be able to stop a state. And I believe that would be a discussion for another time, but the basic, just to give you an illustration of why the government has various feds buying and selling in the black market already. So to say that they wouldn't garner enough revenue to, say, smash the black market and pull people back into the white market where they control it, or is of course very likely, you know.
Okay.
But yeah.
All right. Well, at this point, we've got about 10 minutes left. Is there anything at this point that you'd like to articulate you don't feel you've had enough time for yet, or that you just like to take an opportunity to say?
Yes, and that is the idea that Hoppe is a reactionary statist, you know,
Okay.
or a fascist statist. And what they'll do is they'll bring up this one quote, either like the only people who I take seriously, because one of the quotes they'll bring up where Hoppe points out the fact that towns would ban uh, uh, Jews, Zulus, etc., also mentions Germans. So apparently, these people are saying that in Hoppe's ideal society, the ethnicity that Hoppe is, or German, would be banned. But what they really pull up is the infamous quote from Democracy, which I'm sure most of the people have seen. I can't really read it out right now because it's very long. But that is the quote saying that communists, Democrats, and the advocates of homosexuality, alternative lifestyles, nature worship, etc., would be physically removed from society. Well, the first thing to note is that Hoppe, of course, the fact that physical removal does not mean a free helicopter ride. What it means is physical separation or ostracization, disassociation, etc. But number two is the fact that a lot of people miss the point where Hoppe says physically remove peoples who are antithetical to the goal of a covenant community. So, for example, if you a covenant community's goal is to protect private property, that of course means that they'll get rid of people who would say that they're going to steal private property at the threat of a gun, like, for example, communists. Communists, by definition of being communist, but want to steal people's property for redistribution and whatnot. So that obviously will be removed. But Hoppe specifically mentions in a kin-centered covenant community, the advocates of, which of course does not mean the people of, but the advocates of, say, homosexuality will be physically removed. Not necessarily homosexuals themselves, but the advocates of. What this refers to is, of course, the what are referred, like, for example, social justice warriors and pink pillars, you know. But even then, let's say you can, of course, flip this on its head, and I'm sure that I know for a fact Hoppe would acknowledge this, that in the aforementioned LGBT community, homophobes would, of course, be physically removed from their society. Like, for example, that's another thing that people forget to mention. That there is not one society. There are multiple covenant communities, and there are, of course, multiple societies. This is, of course, how it's been through all of human history and will be till the end of time. It's impossible to have one society unless everywhere else is nuclear paste. But I think you get my point, that this idea, like, even then, if you actually like listen to Hoppe's speeches, even in the most risque ones, where he's talking about covenant communities and whatnot, he does not mention that any violence or whatnot should be brought to homosexuals. Like, I'm the opposite of a straight person. I think many people who know me know how fucking gay I am, and if I can tell you that from personal anecdote, that I don't feel like I'm getting threatened with. I don't feel like Hoppe's threatening to throw me into the Atlantic Ocean every speech he gives. Like, I'm sure you can figure out, yeah, there's something wrong with this position, that Hoppe's some reactionary statist who wants to kill the gays and the immigrants and whatnot. And, like, sure, you can disagree with Hoppe on immigration in the short term. Like, he does not believe that in state borders during or in Afghanistan. Like, that's obvious. But he believes that in the current situation with the welfare warfare state, it is preferable to have state borders than to have a regime of open borders for his various reasons, which, of course, you can disagree with, but you can't say he's a statist because of it, or that that everything else he said is worthless. Well, like, for example, Lysander Spooner believed in intellectual property laws. Ludwig von Mises believed in military conscription. Rothbard believed in allowing abortion and has a lot of a lot of people would say that his views on children are, of course, not exactly up to date and are a bit controversial. But you don't ignore or throw away everything else those three brilliant men have thought of just because they were wrong on some issues, not even their 4 issues, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And
well,
if you... Oh, go ahead.
One of the things I like to say is, any time I'm having a conversation with someone about anything, let me be the first to say, I know I'm wrong about something that I believe. How do I know that? Because I couldn't possibly be the only person who's got it all right.
Yeah.
And the same can be said for any great thinker, no matter how great they were, couldn't possibly have been the one person in all of history that had it all right.
Yep. And, like, if you want to disassociate with Hoppe because he doesn't... Not that he doesn't want to... Or not that he wants to supposedly throw gays into the ocean, which he doesn't, but that he doesn't approve of homosexuality, or that he believes that traditionalism or the traditional family is going to be dominant in society, which even I, as a gay man, believe will be the case, that you can only have these alternative lifestyles if you have a traditional nuclear family base, but that's its own issue. Like, if you want to knock on Hoppe for that, or God help you, these endless misinterpretations of one quote, well, you're missing out on a whole bunch of stuff. You are missing out on quite possibly the most important libertarian thinker that lives, that lives today. You are missing out on argumentation ethics. You are missing out on his near completion of the Austrian method. You are missing out on his historical analysis. You are missing out on so much just because you want to stand by this your false interpretation of this quote, instead of facing your intellectual failures and saying that this person is not actually evil, So that's just the thing. That's what I'm want to leave off on.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having this discussion. I hope everybody who's watched has had an opportunity to learn something. So if you're watching, feel free to put your comments down or send me a message on Discord. Somehow I have a feeling one of those will be coming very shortly.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me on, by the way.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. So just quick for everybody watching, give a shout out to your channel and, the work you do.
Oh, yeah. I'm gonna be making videos soon again. Like, I'm hoping to have something out by December. But what I'm doing is I'm hosting a animation live stream every Monday. They are a blast, and I'm talking with a very fluffy dragon. We go over a whole bunch of awesome topics, a whole bunch of cool shit, and you'll have a fun time if you join, even for a few minutes. So I hope to see you there every Monday, 12 o'clock Pacific time, or noon Pacific time to 3 p.m. We're going to be having a party. So hope to see you there.
Okay. As soon as this is over, I'll go ahead and get a link to Hoploo's channel in the description. I forgot to do that when I created the stream, but as soon as it's done rendering after this, I will go ahead and do that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Anyways, thanks everybody for watching. Like I said, hope you learned something. And I would encourage everyone, this is, especially among libertarians, tend to be pretty intelligent people. It is very easy to, whether you're for Hoppe, whether you're against him, it's very easy for all of us to start believing we're always right. I would just encourage everyone, keep an open mind, and I don't want to limit libertarianism in any way to one particular way of thinking, or unnecessarily start spewing people out of the discussion because you're not really a libertarian. And let's face it, look at the comment section of any video by any ANCAP YouTuber, and you'll see that happens far too often. So, anyways, again, Hoploo, thanks for being here. And as always, that is my 2 cents. So take it for what it's worth.